I used to love fishing. Some of my fondest early memories involved being at a lake or by a creek with my parents. Dad loved teaching us how to fish. When we were really young, Dad would strip clean a long branch with a fishing line tied to the end of it. With a simple bobber and worm set up, Dad planted within my brothers and I a lifelong love of fishing and being in the outdoors. My brothers still love it. And I did too, until the last time I went fishing. That was 12 years ago. I was living in another city, far from my family. I was hired by a very prestigious company. The pay was more than I could have asked for. And very simply, it was an opportunity that I could not pass up. I moved there in the fall of that year. After several months of being in the new city, I got accustomed to the job and the routine. When spring came around, I was feeling the itch to find a peaceful fishing spot. Since I had no family or friends, I brought up the topic of fishing with some of the guys in the office. A guy named Travis told me that he loved fishing. It turned out that we actually had a lot in common. Travis's dad also took him fishing a lot as a kid, and he caught the bug early on. Travis said that he knew several spots within driving distance and was willing to take me out. Soon enough, we made plans and started hanging out outside of work to fish. I'm a bit of an introvert, but it was actually nice to make a new buddy who was interested in something that I was into. Travis was just a year older than I was, and he had only joined the company 2 years before I did. We were both bachelors living in respectable apartments, so neither one of us owned much to tie us down, including a boat. But that was okay since we both preferred to bank fish. There was something really peaceful about just sitting by a lake or a creek and enjoying nature. It turned out that Travis didn't really know that many places to fish, so we ended up exploring and finding fishing holes together. We found some really nice places and some that weren't so nice. At some point in the summer, we found a gorgeous stretch along a river that we both liked. It was not too close to the city, so there usually wasn't a lot of traffic. But there was a well-cared-for trail that ran parallel with the riverbank. Aside from fellow fishermen, Travis and I encountered joggers, hikers, bird watchers, and photographers out there. This river became a favorite spot for us. We realized that if we hiked about a mile further and off of the main trail a bit, there were several more secluded spots that produced lots of nice fish, particularly catfish, our favorite target species. As a particularly stressful week was coming to an end, I asked Travis if he wanted to go fishing on Friday night. We really enjoyed night fishing for catfish at our favorite river spot. With nothing else to do, Travis agreed. Unfortunately, when Friday came, there was an issue in Travis's department and he ended up working 2 hours longer than he planned. Despite that, he still wanted to go fishing. We realized that we were going to get to our spot after sunset, but that wasn't a big deal since we knew the spot well. Travis called me when he finally left the office. The plan was for me to head over and pick him up. We could grab some fast food on the way out to the river. It was going to be a moonless night, but we both agreed this would be great for big catfish. Sure enough, by the time we parked in the gravel parking area, it was pitch black. We each had head-mounted flashlights, so the 1.5-mile hike wasn't so bad. Once we reached our spot, we spread out a bit. Like usual, Travis set up as I walked down to the next opening in the brush to access the bank. I got my line into the water and finally exhaled. I could feel the stress of the week falling off my tense shoulders. After an hour, I hadn't had so much as a nibble. Travis had no luck either. I grabbed my gear and walked down just a bit further. As I set up, I could hear water splashing and fish breaking the surface to feed. In the dark, this sound brought a smile to my face as I quickly cast my line towards the sound. Almost immediately, boom, I got my first bite. It felt like a decent fish as I celebrated with a fist pump. Moments later, I was placing a nice channel catfish on my stringer. Suddenly, a really slow night of fishing turned into a great night of fishing. With almost every cast, I caught a fish. I let the small ones go, and I kept the good-sized eaters. Later, Travis checked on me and was pleasantly surprised to see my catch. I point towards the honey hole I had found, and Travis could hear the fish breaking the surface actively. At that moment, something weird happened. A man in his 30s suddenly appeared. We never heard him walk up to us. He just sort of appeared. He was wearing a thin black windbreaker top with blue jeans. He greeted us pleasantly, which scared the crap out of both of us. The guy laughed and apologized for startling us. He asked us if we caught anything. I stammered that we were doing okay. I was creeped out and really unnerved by this guy. He just gave off an eerie vibe. We never did get a good look at his face. Even though he had startled us, neither of us wanted to shine a light in the guy's face. Thinking back, I can only really remember seeing him from about chest level down. "Well, good luck, you guys," the man said gleefully. "I should be heading off." And quietly, the guy walked away and down the trail. Once his back was to us, we both looked up with our headlamps and could see him clear from behind. We both stared for a few seconds, then turned to look at each other. When we looked up at the trail again, the guy was gone. We were both completely befuddled by the encounter. Why the hell was that guy out here in the middle of the night with no gear, not even a flashlight? Weird. Creepy. Neither of us could quite explain it, but we shrugged it off since we were more interested in fishing. We figured he just walked fast and went around a corner or something. Travis found a spot and put his line in the water near where the fish were most active. Soon he started pulling in fish too. Over the next couple of hours we both slayed. We stopped keeping fish because both of our stringers were getting too heavy to carry out. When I checked my watch, it was almost 3 a.m. I sat down on the patch of grass in front of me. I placed one hand on my lower back and straightened it. I held my breath, then exhaled deeply as I felt the muscles in my back stretch. I lifted my chin up and looked into the night sky. There were a lot of stars out. This made me smile. At that moment, the fishing pole in my other hand started to twitch, indicating another bite. I clicked my headlamp on. For a brief instant, the light flashed and lit up the tree to my right. Up in the tree, I thought I saw a pair of legs. I froze for a moment. I was trying to process what I just saw. Even the pulling of my fishing rod could not jar me out of it. Instantly, I looked back into the tree, and sure enough, there were a pair of legs in blue jeans with a pair of dirty Nike sneakers. "Oh crap," I muttered as I walked closer. I craned my head around a branch full of leaves. That's when I saw him. There was a man hanging from a thick branch. A rope was tied around his neck. His body swayed with the breeze. I was no expert, but it seems that the man had been out there for at least a few days. His face was badly decomposed. That's when I noticed the most morbid thing I had ever seen. There seemed to be movement in his eye sockets. As I squinted to get a clearer look, I realized the moving things were maggots. The numerous crawling things moved in and about, hollowing out the man's eyes and nostrils. As the maggots mindlessly squirmed, they fell into the river below. Now it made sense why the fish were so active there. I dropped my fishing pole in horror. I walked over to Travis and grabbed him firmly. "Trav, listen. Don't freak out," I said. I shined my headlamp up into the tree to show my friend. Right on cue, he freaked out. Travis wanted to leave right away. "Let's go right now. Forget about the gear. If you don't go, I'm leaving without you," Travis threatened. So we left. I had no interest in sitting there with the dead guy by myself. We double-timed it out of there in silence. When we got back to the car, we called 911 and waited. It took 30 minutes for a deputy to get out there. We explained what we saw. I don't think that deputy was interested in investigating a suicide victim in the middle of the night by himself. He radioed for other first responders. When other responders got there, they hiked out to the location we described. A couple of other deputies split us up. We were both questioned separately. Afterwards, we sat mostly in silence on the tailgate of my pickup truck. "Travis, are you okay, man?" I asked. "Did you notice the dead guy's clothes?" Travis asked me after a few moments of silence. It was the same clothes that the weird guy who showed up out of nowhere wore. Travis and I stopped fishing after that. We hung out a couple of more times afterwards, but we never talk about what happened. I got curious, so I called the county sheriff's office to follow up on the matter. The deputy we first met just told us that they found the guy's family, and as far as they were concerned, the matter was closed as a suicide. I never did tell Travis. He seemed to take the whole night harder than I did. For weeks afterwards, Travis showed up to work looking exhausted, like he had slept very little. Less than 2 months after that night, Travis quit his job and moved. I didn't even know he was quitting, and I never heard from him again.
My wife and I have always enjoyed a good scare. When we first met, one of the things we talked about was ghost stories. Neither of us had had a lot of significant personal experiences. We each had our own stories of seeing a shadow here or hearing a noise there. We both experienced mild night terror encounters, but none of it was really terrifying. However, during our first year of marriage, we experienced something that was really kind of creepy. Technically, she experienced it, but I was there. After our wedding, we moved to a city that neither of us had ever lived in before. I took a brand new job. It was my first real job out of college. We timed it so we could marry right away after my graduation, but right before the new job started. It was a hectic but really enjoyable time with lots of big life changes. It turned out that I had lots of extended family members who lived in the new city we were moving to. This was actually really exciting for my wife since she came from a small family. Now she was going to have numerous aunts and uncles and cousins galore. She was very much looking forward to being a part of a big family, complete with all the family picnics, holidays, weddings, reunions, and yes, even funerals. Almost right away, we were invited to dinners, birthday parties, and various other festivities. My wife loved every bit of it, as she worked hard to familiarize herself with everyone in my family and tried to fit in. It was actually very endearing watching her. Less than a year into our marriage, we had our first funeral. He was a much older member of the family, a great uncle to me. The old man had been very accomplished as a young man and was highly respected, both in and outside of the family. I mentioned his name to my wife a couple of times, but the chance never came up for us to meet him prior to his death. Now there would be no chance. It was a bit of a shame. As the date of the funeral approached, it turned out that it would be in the next town over. This small town was about an hour and a half drive. As someone who likes to drive, I could do a drive like that in my sleep. However, since I had a cousin that I was particularly close with living in that town, he called and invited my wife and I to come hang out the day before. We took him up on the offer and we drove into town the day before the funeral. When we arrived, it was a low-key get-together. My cousin threw some steaks onto the grill, and we just kicked back with some beers. He had a couple of cute kids who loved getting to know my wife. If not for the funeral, it would have been a really fun night. As the evening got later, my cousin and I continued to sit up and chat about the old days. There were also a couple of West Coast college basketball games on. They were playing on ESPN. Eventually, the women got tired, and they decided to call it night. A makeshift bed was set up in the basement for us. To be clear, their basement was not creepy at all. It was a fully furnished basement with plush carpeting. My cousin even built out a nice full bathroom down there. I remember visiting him when I was a single guy and wanting to crash at his place all the time because his basement was so comfortable. The basement was not a walkout, but it did have a couple of decent-sized windows to allow plenty of natural sunlight in. There were no blinds, but both windows had nice curtains that blocked out the light nicely if closed all the way. Anyways, as my cousin and I continued our male revelry, my wife retreated to the basement to lay down. About an hour later, with a perfect buzz going, I decided to call it a night. The last thing I wanted to do was to get fully drunk, then show up at a funeral with a hangover. I tried my best to be quiet as I joined my wife in the basement. I quickly changed into some shorts for bed. The moment I laid down, my young wife turned towards me, and she clutched my torso. We were newlyweds, so we were still at that stage where this kind of affection was pretty commonplace. I didn't think it was strange. I smiled and apologized for waking her up. I was still awake, waiting for you, she said as she squeezed me tighter. I chuckled and exhaled as she squeezed hard enough for me to release a beer burp. I wrapped my arms around her and held her close to me. She whispered some small talk to me. I tried to respond as coherently as I could. But obviously the buzz and exhaustion was taking over. Before I realized it, it was morning. My wife was not by my side. Sunlight was pouring in through the basement windows. My thin eyelids proved to be no match for the sunlight. I pulled the blankets up and over my head. But just seconds later, I felt the full weight of my petite wife fall on top of me. "You better get up or we're going to be late for the funeral," she chided me. 2 hours later, we pulled into a packed parking lot at the funeral home. Luckily, we found an available spot and we parked quickly. I took my beautiful wife's hand and together we walked into the funeral home. I remembered in that moment I was very proud to have married such a beautiful woman who really wanted to be a part of my large and crazy family. I had received nothing but compliments on picking the right girl. My wife greeted many of the women she had previously met with hugs and kisses all around. Then suddenly, as I was making small talk, I felt her small hand take my hand and clutch it firmly. "Honey, what's wrong? Are you okay?" She smiled demurely at me and nodded, indicating that all was well. Her behavior, however, was odd. She wasn't being her usual friendly, bubbly self. She suddenly became clingy. In private, she would often show me affection by being clingy in a cute way. But in public, my wife always understood decorum, and she did not display unnecessary affection. Yet here she was, holding my hand and clinging to my forearms, like something was after her. We went through the funeral service like that. On the drive to the burial, my wife was quiet in the car. When I tried to ask her what was wrong, she said she didn't want to talk about it just yet. I dropped the matter. I thought that perhaps someone in the family had said something unkind to her and hurt her feelings a bit. About an hour later, we said our goodbyes to everyone and started to drive home. Suddenly, my beautiful wife, who was not prone to emotional outbursts, burst into tears. It scared me because I thought something was really wrong. Did I do something? I thought maybe I did something to hurt her. Immediately, I pulled off into a rest stop so we could talk. After a few minutes of one of the hardest bouts of crying that I had ever seen her have up until that point in our marriage, she calmed down enough to talk to me, and this is what she said. Last night, when she went downstairs to get ready for bed, she saw something strange. My wife said that she was not thinking about anything scary, and the basement itself offered no creepy vibes. My wife changed into her pajamas, then laid down. She turned her head and noticed the two basement windows. She noticed that the curtains were not completely closed for both windows. The windows were not big, but they were wide basement-type windows. Both sets of curtains were open by about 3 or 4 feet each. Suddenly, out of nowhere, she saw the face of an old man. He wasn't particularly scary looking. He seemed to have a blank look on his face. He might have been crouching down or even laying on his belly and just had his blank face up to the window. My wife said at first she wasn't afraid. She was shocked and wondered if perhaps an elderly neighbor had gotten confused or something. This young version of my wife was always so optimistic. She closed her eyes to blink away any blurriness or confusion as a result of the beer and steaks. Sure enough, the face of the old man was still there. Now my wife was getting scared. She was too scared to get up, and she was too scared to call out. She took the blanket and pulled it up over her head. She said she didn't know how long she hid under the blanket, but it didn't seem very long before my heavy footsteps came downstairs to sleep. When I settled in next to her, that's when she clutched me. She said she worked up enough courage to look at the window, and the old man was gone. She breathed a sigh of relief and started to make small talk with me. Stupidly, she said she took another look at the window, and he was back. That was when she squeezed me hard again, and I gave my burp. She closed her eyes tightly and held me, mostly out of fear and nervousness. She turned into a chatterbox and talked until she heard me gently snoring. Moments later, she fell asleep also. In the morning, only bright sunlight could be seen at the windows. My wife shook off the whole incident and attributed it to beer and a bit of the wine that my cousin's wife had shared with her. By the time we left for the funeral, she said she had forgotten about the entire incident. She decided that she would tell me about it when we got home later that night. Then, when we got to the funeral, the previous night's strange events hit her like a ton of bricks. As she went around greeting some of the women that she knew in my family, she walked by the picture table that had been set up. There were photos displaying my great-uncle's life. She stopped dead in her tracks. It took everything she had not to burst into tears right then and there. The face she saw in the window was my great-uncle.